January 1940. The air above the North Atlantic hangs heavy with winter fog. Harbor lights are dimmed, sound is muted, even the sea seems restrained, as if aware it is being watched. Behind guarded docks and steel barriers, a hull sits in silence. No markings, no registry number, no public record. Naval personnel pass without salutes, without names spoken aloud. Orders are delivered verbally. Notes are burned. Cameras are forbidden. What lies before them is not meant to exist. Across Europe, war has already begun to reshape the oceans. Merchant ships vanish into black water. Convoys are hunted. Admirals speak in cautious tones, aware that traditional steel and firepower are failing against unseen enemies below the waves. And so, far from public shipyards and newspaper headlines, a different kind of vessel is taking form. One born not of naval tradition, but of desperation, designed to solve a problem so dangerous that even acknowledging the solution could compromise it. Years later, official documents would deny it ever sailed. Some would insist it was only a rumor, others a myth. But in the winter of 1940, this ship was real, and its secrecy was absolute. The world that created it did not emerge overnight. It was shaped by fear, loss, and a rapidly collapsing balance at sea, forces already in motion long before the first rivet was set. By the opening months of 1940, the war at sea had already diverged from the expectations of pre-war planners. The great fleets of Europe, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers built for decisive surface engagements, were discovering that dominance was no longer decided by what could be seen. It was decided by what could not. German U-boats had returned to the Atlantic with ruthless efficiency. Operating in wolf packs, they slipped beneath convoy screens, striking at night, often without warning. Merchant vessels burned quietly in the darkness. Crews were given minutes, sometimes seconds, to abandon ship. Tonnage-lost figures climbed week after week, and with them rose an unspoken realization inside Allied command rooms. Industrial power meant nothing if it could not cross the ocean. Britain, more than any other nation, felt the pressure first. Its survival depended on imports, food, fuel, raw materials. The Royal Navy remained the largest in the world, yet it was stretched thin across multiple theaters. Escort vessels were insufficient in number. Sonar was still unreliable. Air cover faded beyond the reach of coastal bases. The Atlantic contained vast, lethal gaps where convoys sailed blind. By late 1939, the Admiralty's internal assessments were grim. Losses were approaching levels that, if sustained, could force Britain to the negotiating table within a year. Winston Churchill, newly returned to the Admiralty as First Lord, demanded solutions, but not slogans. He wanted results, and he wanted them quickly. Traditional shipbuilding timelines were too slow. Even a simple escort required months of construction and training. Incremental improvements would not close the gap in time. What the situation demanded, some argued, was a leap, something unconventional, something the enemy would not anticipate. Similar conclusions were being drawn elsewhere. In Canada, the United States, and within classified British research committees, naval architects and scientists began revisiting ideas once dismissed as impractical or too radical. Materials shortages forced experimentation. Steel was prioritized for tanks, guns, and aircraft. Shipyards were congested. Labor was strained. Every solution created new constraints. And layered over all of it was intelligence. German naval intelligence had proven adept at tracking convoy routes, port schedules, and ship types. Any new vessel openly discussed risked immediate countermeasures. If a radically different ship was to be built, it could not merely be secret, it had to be deniable. Thus, in late 1939 and early 1940, the environment that would give birth to the ship that never existed was already firmly in place. A war accelerating faster than doctrine, a navy fighting an enemy beneath the surface, and a leadership increasingly willing to authorize projects that would never appear in public budgets or official histories. That willingness, however, came with a cost, for secrecy on this scale demanded not just silence, but isolation, compartmentalization, and a willingness to erase evidence after the fact. Those conditions would soon define the project itself. as the context of global war narrowed into something far more specific and far more controlled. By early 1940, secrecy had become a strategic resource in its own right. The Allies were no longer merely competing in ship numbers or firepower. They were competing in ideas that could not be allowed to leak, even accidentally. Inside Britain, a parallel wartime structure had begun to operate alongside the conventional armed forces, committees with deliberately vague titles, research departments buried inside ministries, projects funded through indirect channels, their purposes known only to a handful of senior officials. The objective was simple: remove innovation from enemy observation entirely. The most famous of these organizations would later become known as the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, but even before its formal creation, the mindset already existed. Engineers were encouraged to think beyond steel hulls and orthodox designs. Scientists from civilian backgrounds, chemists, physicists, material specialists, were quietly drawn into naval problem-solving. Their brief was not elegance or tradition, but survival. One pressure dominated all others: escort endurance. Conventional escort vessels required fuel, refit cycles, train crews, and steel, large quantities of it. They could not be produced quickly enough, nor operate long enough in the mid-Atlantic air gap where U-boats thrived. Aircraft could hunt submarines, but only within limited range. The ocean beyond was still a killing ground. This gap produced an uncomfortable question inside Allied planning circles. What if a ship did not need to return to port often? What if it could remain at sea for extended periods, immune to torpedoes, difficult to detect, and cheap enough to be produced without draining steel reserves? Such questions were not theoretical. They were driven by weekly loss reports, by statistics pinned to walls in operations rooms, by handwritten notes from convoy commanders who watched ships disappear under them. The answer, some argued, lay not in building more of the same, but in abandoning assumptions entirely about materials, visibility, even what constituted a ship. These discussions were never recorded in open minutes. When they were written down, they were coded. When decisions were made, they were passed verbally. Location mattered as much as design. Any construction would need to occur away from major shipyards, away from routine inspections, and away from civilian eyes. Remote lakes, frozen in winter and inaccessible by road, suddenly became valuable. Facilities previously considered useless to naval construction were quietly repurposed. At the same time, Allied intelligence feared something equally dangerous: ridicule. A radical design, if discovered too early, could invite mockery, skepticism, and political resistance. Worse, it could alert German intelligence to a vulnerability they had not yet considered. Silence was safer than debate. Thus the project, still unnamed, still undefined, was shaped by a unique convergence: strategic desperation, material scarcity, scientific improvisation, and an intelligence environment where acknowledgement itself posed a risk. What emerged from this context was not simply a vessel, but an idea so unusual that it could survive only in secrecy, an idea that would test the limits of wartime innovation and force its creators to choose between effectiveness and erasure. Those tensions would become clearer when the project is examined from multiple perspectives, each revealing a different facet of why this ship could never be allowed to exist openly. The first angle through which this project must be understood is human, not in terms of heroics, but in restraint. The men assigned to it were not celebrated sailors or public engineers. They were selected precisely because they could disappear into bureaucracy. Many were reservists, academics, or civilian specialists pulled into uniformed roles with minimal explanation. Their instructions were narrow, their knowledge compartmentalized. Some would spend months working on a single problem without knowing how it fit into the larger design. Others were told only what their hands needed to do, not why. Correspondence with families was monitored. Locations were disguised. Even within the Royal Navy, few officers could claim a full understanding of the project's scope. Technologically, the ship represented a departure from naval orthodoxy. Traditional assumptions, steel hulls, watertight compartments, armor plating were re-examined under the lens of scarcity and survivability. Steel was not only expensive, it was a liability. It could sink. It required complex industrial processes. It was vulnerable to magnetic mines and acoustic detection. Designers began exploring materials that behaved differently in water, materials that absorbed shock rather than transmitting it, that could survive damage without catastrophic failure. This thinking aligned with broader wartime experimentation, but here it was taken to an extreme. The ship was not meant to outrun or outgun the enemy. It was meant to endure. Tactically, its envisioned role defied existing categories. It was not a destroyer, not a carrier, not a cruiser. It would not chase U-boats or engage surface fleets. Instead, it would sit astride vital sea lanes like a silent presence, part base, part escort, part deterrent. Aircraft could operate from it. Supplies could be stored aboard. Crews could rotate through it without requiring constant port access. This created unease within traditional naval command. The ship did not fit established doctrines of engagement or command hierarchy. Who would control it? Fleet command? Coastal command? Air command? Its very existence threatened to blur lines that had defined naval warfare for generations. Yet the numbers spoke for themselves. Projections showed reduced losses, extended coverage, lower steel consumption. The calculations were cold, mathematical, and persuasive. Still, each of these angles carried risk. Human secrecy strained morale. Technological novelty invited failure. Tactical ambiguity created political friction. The project advanced not because it was comfortable, but because alternatives were worse. And as more senior figures became aware of what was being proposed, new angles emerged, ones shaped by leadership responsibility, enemy reaction, and the moral weight of pursuing a weapon that would never be acknowledged if it succeeded. From the perspective of leadership, the project posed a problem with no precedent. Senior naval officials were being asked to authorize a vessel that would not appear in fleet registers, that could not be mentioned in Parliament, and whose failure would never be publicly defended. Responsibility would be absolute, accountability invisible. Churchill himself embodied this contradiction. He encouraged radical thinking and personal initiative, yet understood the political danger of projects that could not be easily explained. If the ship worked, it would quietly save lives. If it failed, it would need to vanish, along with the paper trail that led to it. For commanders accustomed to clarity of command and tradition, this was deeply unsettling. Enemy perception formed another critical angle. German naval intelligence was effective, but not omniscient. It relied on patterns, ship silhouettes, convoy behavior, production statistics. The proposed vessel threatened none of those expectations directly. In fact, its designers hoped it would be dismissed outright if ever detected. Its shape, composition, and operating profile were so unusual that they risked being misidentified as natural formations or harmless infrastructure. This ambiguity was intentional. A weapon unrecognized as a weapon could alter the tactical balance without provoking an immediate response. Yet this also meant that its success depended on continued disbelief. Once the enemy understood what it was, countermeasures would follow. Morally, the project existed in a gray zone. Resources were being diverted from conventional shipbuilding to an unproven concept, while sailors continued to die at sea. Engineers knew that failure would not simply mean cancellation, it could cost months of irreplaceable time. The silence imposed on participants meant doubts were rarely voiced openly. Dissent, when it occurred, remained private. There was also the ethical weight of erasure. The ship's crew, should it ever sail, would operate knowing that their service might never be acknowledged. No medals, no public record, even survival would come with anonymity. This was not heroism as nations preferred to remember it. It was service stripped of recognition. And yet, within these angles lay the reason the project moved forward. Leadership accepted the risk because the alternative was visible collapse. Enemy ignorance offered a fleeting advantage. Moral discomfort was outweighed by strategic necessity. All of these forces converged toward a moment when theory would meet reality. Calculations would give way to construction. Secrecy would collide with physics, weather, and war. That moment, when the project left the realm of ideas and entered the world, would become its turning point. The decisive shift came not with a battle, but with a commitment. In mid-1942, after months of paper studies, scaled experiments, and closed-door briefings, approval was granted for construction to begin, not in a shipyard, not even near the sea, but in a place chosen specifically to avoid attention. The location was a remote lake in Western Canada, isolated, frozen for much of the year, and accessible only by limited transport routes. On maps, it appeared insignificant. In reality, it offered everything the project required: concealment, cold temperatures ideal for material stability, and jurisdictional distance from prying eyes. The site was secured under the guise of routine military activity. Guards were posted. Access lists were short. Construction began quietly. What took shape there was unlike any vessel the world had seen. The hull was massive, yet strangely muted in appearance. Its form lacked the sharp lines of warships. There was no steel skeleton in the conventional sense. Instead, engineers worked with a composite material, an ice-based mixture reinforced with wood pulp, later known in internal documents as Pykrete. Tests had shown it to be remarkably resilient. Bullets flattened against it. Explosives fractured its surface without catastrophic failure. Most importantly, it floated. The choice was radical, even by wartime standards. Ice was abundant, steel was not. The material could be repaired at sea, it absorbed shock, and in cold water it remained stable far longer than intuition suggested. Refrigeration systems were planned to maintain integrity even in warmer conditions. As the hull grew, so did the tension. Engineers monitored cracking patterns. Power systems were tested repeatedly. Any failure risked validating the skepticism that surrounded the project. High-ranking observers visited under strict secrecy. Notes were taken, then destroyed. By late 1942, the prototype, never officially named in public records, was ready for trials. It displaced thousands of tons. It was slow, immense, silent in a way steel ships were not. When it was finally moved onto open water, those present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Yet even in that moment, uncertainty dominated. The vessel had proven it could exist. It had not yet proven it could function in war. That proof would be demanded soon, by reality rather than theory, when strategic conditions forced a final decision about whether the project would advance, transform, or be quietly abandoned. The trials confirmed what the designers had hoped and what commanders feared. The vessel could float, endure damage, and remain structurally sound under conditions that would cripple conventional ships. Its resistance to explosive force was not theoretical. Charges detonated against its surface produced fractures, not breaches. In cold water, it behaved less like a ship and more like a landmass. But endurance alone was not enough. As evaluations continued into early 1943, the project collided with the realities of war at scale. The ship's immense size created logistical complications that had been underestimated. Its propulsion systems, designed for slow, steady movement rather than maneuverability, limited its tactical flexibility. Turning radius was vast. Speed was minimal. In an ocean war increasingly defined by rapid response and air power, this mattered. More critically, the strategic environment was changing. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was turning. Improved convoy tactics, long-range aircraft, escort carriers, and advances in radar and sonar began to close the air gap that had once made the project necessary. U-boat losses mounted. German commanders grew cautious. What had been an existential crisis in 1940 was becoming a contest the Allies could plausibly win with conventional means. This shift forced a reassessment at the highest levels. The ship had been conceived in desperation. Now, it was being evaluated in comparison to alternatives that were finally catching up. Steel production increased. Escort numbers rose. Air coverage expanded. The question was no longer whether the ship could work, but whether it was still needed. Cost-benefit analyses, never written in full, circulated in fragments. The vessel would require enormous resources to complete at operational scale. Refrigeration systems consumed power. Crews would require specialized training, deployment would be limited to specific theaters and seasons, and once deployed, its presence could not be hidden forever. Secrecy, which had protected the project, now constrained it. The ship could not be explained to allies easily, it could not be justified to Parliament, and if lost, it could not be replaced quickly. In late 1943, the decision was made quietly. Construction would halt, the prototype would be dismantled, records would be sealed, the concept would remain classified, its lessons absorbed into other programs, its existence officially denied. There was no announcement, no ceremony, the ship did not sink, it simply disappeared. What followed was not an ending, but a long silence, one that would shape how the war was remembered and how this project would nearly vanish from history entirely. In the months following the cancellation, the physical remnants of the project were carefully removed. The remote construction site in Canada was stripped of equipment. Documents were shredded or encoded. Engineers and naval personnel were reassigned, often to conventional shipyards or convoy operations, their knowledge of the project compartmentalized. Some would carry fragments of the experience in memory, but most would remain silent, even decades later. Official reports never mentioned the vessel. Internal communications framed the project as experimental research or material testing. To the public, and to most of the military, the ship had never existed. This deliberate erasure ensured that the knowledge of its construction and potential never entered enemy hands or public scrutiny. Yet despite its disappearance, the lessons endured. The use of composite materials informed subsequent naval experiments and ice-resistant structures. Engineers applied principles of buoyancy, shock absorption, and modular construction in other wartime innovations. The project, though classified and secretive, subtly influenced Allied naval engineering beyond its immediate lifespan. Personnel who had witnessed trials understood both its promise and its limitations. They recorded observations in private notes, sometimes decades later, hinting at a ship that defied conventional expectations. Their testimonies, scattered and inconsistent, were often dismissed by historians as anecdotal or exaggerated. Only piecemeal declassified documents, combined with archival photographs of remote construction sites, could corroborate the reality of what had occurred. The cancellation also reflected the shifting nature of the war itself. By 1943, technological developments, long-range aircraft, radar-equipped escorts, and improved anti-submarine tactics had reduced the need for radical, high-risk projects. What had been conceived in desperation was now rendered strategically redundant. The Allies were beginning to dominate the Atlantic with conventional resources, making the extraordinary unnecessary. Still, the psychological and symbolic impact of the project was significant, even if unacknowledged. For the men involved, it demonstrated that innovation could exist outside traditional channels, that secrecy could protect ideas until their time had passed, and that sometimes the greatest victories were invisible. These developments set the stage for understanding the ship's long-term influence, not on battles fought, but on how naval innovation, secrecy, and strategic imagination would evolve in the years to come. In the years after the war, historians, naval engineers, and military enthusiasts began piecing together fragments of the story. References appeared in memoirs of engineers, cryptic notes in declassified wartime correspondence, and occasional photographs of remote northern construction sites. These clues hinted at a vessel unlike any recorded in naval registries, massive, slow, yet astonishingly resilient. Yet even as scholars attempted to verify its existence, the project remained shrouded in ambiguity. Many accounts conflicted on design details, materials, and operational plans. Some dismissed the reports as exaggerations or wartime rumors. Others speculated that the vessel had never been completed, that it was a conceptual experiment rather than a true prototype. The lack of official acknowledgement made definitive conclusions nearly impossible. Nonetheless, its influence persisted in less obvious ways. Concepts tested during the project informed post-war designs, particularly in ice-strengthened hulls, floating platforms, and experimental naval construction. Engineers who had worked on the project applied lessons of modularity, resilience, and low-cost production in later naval innovations, from Arctic operations to large-scale floating airstrips. These indirect legacies were invisible to the public, but they quietly shaped military engineering for decades. The secrecy surrounding the project also highlighted a wartime paradox. Sometimes, what never existed publicly has the most lasting impact. Unlike celebrated battleships, carriers, or submarines, this ship left no medals, no battle honors, no museum exhibit. Its story existed only in archives, private notes, and whispered recollections. And yet, for the men and women who had built, tested, and safeguarded it, the project remained one of the most extraordinary achievements of the war, proof that human ingenuity could flourish even under the strictest constraints. By the late 20th century, a few historians pieced together the contours of the project. They recognized its originality and scale, acknowledging that it had been far more than a failed experiment. Its existence challenged assumptions about conventional naval warfare, illustrating the lengths nations were willing to go when survival hung in the balance. The quiet dismantling of the ship, the erasure of its records, and the compartmentalization of its knowledge ensured it would occupy a liminal space in history, a phantom vessel that shaped both technology and imagination, while leaving no trace for the casual observer. The story of the ship that never existed is, above all, a story of secrecy and necessity. It reminds us that innovation in war often occurs in shadows, far from public view, driven not by recognition but by survival. The vessel itself may have disappeared, its steel or composite hull dismantled, its name erased, yet the ideas it embodied endured. Engineers learned to think differently about materials, structure, and endurance. Commanders learned to weigh risk in ways that did not require immediate acknowledgement. And the world learned that sometimes the most profound contributions leave no visible mark. This project also speaks to the human dimension of warfare. Men and women, hidden behind layers of bureaucracy and silence, devoted themselves to a task that history might never celebrate. Their labor, anxiety, and ingenuity were real, even if the world remained unaware. In that silence lies a profound lesson. Courage and intelligence do not always seek applause. Sometimes they operate in the quiet spaces where history cannot immediately measure them. Ultimately, the ship represents a tension between visibility and effectiveness, between tradition and innovation. In a war defined by firepower and tonnage, it demonstrated that survival could be engineered through audacity and secrecy rather than brute force. Its legacy is subtle, yet undeniable. It shaped post-war engineering, informed naval strategy, and expanded the boundaries of what was considered possible at sea. And so, even decades later, the frozen harbors and remote lakes of World War II whisper of a vessel that the world was never meant to see, a testament to ingenuity, to human resolve, and to the hidden stories that lie beneath the surface of history.